Okay, I want to call this adjourned meeting to order. As far as roll call, looks like all members are present. I'll recognize that Councilmember Rue. Are you there? Councilmember Rue is on a Zoom call. You there, Bill?
Hey. Yes, I am.
Okay, we got.
I'm here.
All right, so all
I am in Sacramento, California, and I'm in the
Very
public
good.
lobby.
All right, so if all five of our council members are present, and we'll now go into the workshop. This is a proposed ordinance regulating the parking of oversized and recreational vehicles on public streets. And Ed, who do you have?
Well, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council, I'm calling up Jim Eckert. He's our special legal counsel related to matters of prosecution and other issues. So he'll be making the presentation this evening. Of course, council knows that there's been a rash of large vehicles parking on city streets. Last year, we dealt with truck-related issues. This year, we're turning it to recreational-type vehicles. And with that, I'll let Mr. Eckert make the presentation.
Thank you so much.
Hello,
Good
Jim.
evening.
How you doing? Nice seeing you.
I'm doing well, thank you. Good to see you again as well. So let me just jump right into it. We are, as the mayor said, we're looking at the regulation of oversized vehicles. First off, we'll start off with just what our legal authority is. The California Vehicle Code does provide us explicit authority to be able to regulate the parking, stopping, and standing of vehicles on our streets. Tonight, what we're talking about specifically is just the parking on public streets. We're not talking about the parking on private property yet. That will be something that would be brought back to the council at some later point. Why? Why are we talking about this, right? And this is a big issue. Well, the big issue is that really there's kind of three different things that we deal with when we're talking about oversized vehicles. So we'll first start off with what exactly is an oversized vehicle? Oversized vehicle is to be distinguished from an overweight vehicle. Oversized vehicle is literally limited to size-related issues, height, width, and length, okay? And that's to be distinguished again from what we might talk about commercial vehicles, which are typically designated commercial in part because of their weight, typically over 10,000 pounds or over 11,500, depending on the area. Standard type of dimensions that we're talking about are typically lengths exceeding anywhere from 19 to 25 feet. So we're talking length. Width that would exceed somewhere between 6 to 8 feet. And height of a vehicle also somewhere between 6 and 8 feet. And so these are not set out by state law as far as what you have to do to declare it. Some jurisdictions will use 19 feet, some jurisdictions will use 25 feet. Some jurisdictions will use 6 feet in height or 6 feet in width. Other jurisdictions will use 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or even higher. And as I indicate, they're all going to be jurisdictional based on the types of problems that you tend to have in your community. And when we look at the reasons why, then it'll come back to kind of where we set the standards as far as the dimensions. There's typically three primary issues that come into play when we're dealing with oversized vehicles and the health, safety, and welfare of the community. Number one is there's a decreased line of sight visibility. We typically deal with this in the planning community already with corner cutbacks and visibility triangles that we're looking at. But here we're talking about it on the public streets, and we don't worry just about intersections, we also worry about driveways. So if you look at this particular picture, you can see that there is what would be deemed an oversized vehicle. It's a recreational vehicle, and it's parked very close to the edge of a driveway. Now, if there's a vehicle in that residential driveway who's trying to back out of that driveway, they won't be able to see any of the vehicular traffic that's coming down that roadway. What you also notice behind this is a pole. What you may or may not be able to notice is whether or not there's any type of parking signage on there, any other type of traffic control device, any of those sort of things. Why? Because these large oversized vehicles tend to block the visibility of not only the driveway issues, but also our traffic control signage and things of that nature. Another issue of concern with respect to oversized vehicles is reduced on-street parking. As you guys are all well aware, on-street parking has always been a premium, but has become even more of a premium nowadays with things like accessory dwelling units, where we are now removing off-street parking, forcing more people to rely on on-street parking. As we talk about the length of these sort of vehicles, again, most jurisdictions will use anywhere from 19 feet and higher. But as we talk about them, the average vehicle is somewhere between 7 to 10 feet long. These oversized vehicles are 2 to 3 times longer, therefore taking up 2 to 3 times as many parking spaces as a normal vehicle would. And so that creates a big issue for our community, especially in the residential zones. Another issue, of course, is decreased drivable roadway space. And so as you can see by the picture that I just put up there, these oversized vehicles, when we're talking about the width of the vehicle, take up more roadway than a regular passenger vehicle, thereby allowing for the drivable area to be decreased and creating greater problems, especially on narrower streets. So these are the types of issues that we're trying to address when we talk about regulating the oversized vehicles. Now, how can we regulate oversized vehicles? There's a lot of actually different options that the city has. And when we go through these options, understand that you would not be the first to do any of these options. All of these options are options that other jurisdictions are already doing. So one of them is a complete ban. The city could create a complete ban on oversized vehicle parking. Now, we're not talking about driving through our city. We can't stop them from driving through our city, not just based on their size. But we can ban them from parking in our city. Now, we would have to create limited exceptions, and we'll go through a couple of those exceptions in a little bit, but typically those are delivery vehicles. We still have to allow things like UPS and FedEx and Amazon to be able to come by, moving vehicles. We still have to allow for interstate commerce to come by, disability issues. So there are some limited exceptions that you would still have to do even if we did a complete ban. Another option would be to do restricted hours. And this is something that a lot of cities do when they're trying to prohibit, for example, overnight parking. They may do a limited amount of parking for oversized vehicles between, let's say, the hours of 2 a.m. and 6 a.m. Or they could do it for a longer period of time, 8 p.m. to 6 a.m. But that's just another methodology of trying to reduce some of the problems. Of course, this doesn't reduce the problems when they're occurring during the daytime hours. This is only dealing with it at the nighttime. But it does at least address the parking. Because typically, especially in the residential areas, the premium time for parking would be at nighttime when people are coming home from work. Another is you could do restricted areas. That is, what you could do is you could allow for oversized vehicle parking to be prohibited in certain areas of the city, certain zones, residential zones and the like, and allow them to be parked in commercial or industrial areas only. And that's just, like I say, just a different option. And then one thing you can do, irrespective of which of those three options you do, is to provide for parking permits. And this is different from a preferential parking district. This would be permits that would be provided specifically to occupants of a particular residential structure. And what most cities are doing is they would be providing them for RVs, because RVs, of course, would fall within the category of oversized vehicles. But you could potentially provide these types of permits for other types of oversized vehicles as well. So these are kind of four of the different options that the city could do in an effort to regulate oversized vehicles in order to achieve the goal of trying to address those health and safety concerns that we talked about earlier. Now, what I've provided for you here is just a sampling of some of the regulations that are in neighboring jurisdictions. As you'll notice, the cities of Claremont, Fontana, Laverne, Pomona, and Rancho Cucamonga all have similar types of regulations. And some of them, what they've done is they prohibited on-street parking at nighttime hours completely in excess of anywhere from a half hour to 2 hours. Anybody that wants to park beyond that, and that's passenger cars, oversized vehicles, and the like, would be required to get permits. In other cities, what they've done is they've just specifically prohibited oversized vehicles, such as if you look at the city of Fontana, they prohibit oversized vehicles and RV parking in excess of 4 hours in residential zones. And again, so they've kind of done this combination of restricting them in certain areas, but also doing the time limit. You've also got the city of Pomona, who does a no oversized vehicle parking or RV parking between the hours of 8 p.m. and 7 a.m. at all, unless you get a permit. And then they have a limited hour parking during the daytime hours, so no more than 4-hour parking. And then you can see kind of the different permit programs as well that they have. And there's always a limited number of permits that are going to be issued. And the different jurisdictions vary from offering a certain number per month or a certain number per year. And it could range from anywhere from 3 to, I've seen as much as one city who offers 96 permits per year. The difference in the number of permits that they issue is typically based on how long the permits are valid for. So cities that offer more permits typically tend to make those permits only valid for one night, whereas cities that offer less permits might make them last for anywhere from 2 to 3 days. that would cover like a weekend. So if someone's going to come home, they're going to pack up, go on a trip, they could use the same permit both for loading the vehicle as well as for unloading the vehicle when they get back. The next chart that I'm putting up here is just some of the bigger cities, not necessarily directly around you, but that prohibit. And as you can see, Anaheim, Long Beach, Los Angeles, San Diego, Santa Monica, Santa Barbara all have some level of prohibition of the parking or stopping or standing of oversized vehicles. This is one where you can look at. San Diego actually offers 72 permits per year, but they're only valid for up to 24 hours. Whereas if you look at Long Beach, it's 20 permits per year, but they're valid for up to 72 hours. And then you've got some cities like Anaheim that offer no permits whatsoever. They have a complete ban on parking of oversized vehicles in the city, and they don't offer any permits. So the reality is there's this whole kind of spectrum that the city could look at if it was trying to, again, achieve the results of protecting health, safety, and welfare as a result of these oversized vehicles. So in addition to covering this, excuse me, what we have provided the council is a draft copy of an ordinance. It's not necessarily one that's going to be explicitly provided to the council, but it's one that's being looked at right now. And what it does do is it does a complete ban on all oversized vehicles and recreational vehicles, as well as unattached trailers. Because this is another issue that we find a lot of in this community as well as others are the trailers that just get parked on the public streets, and they're left there because they unhitch it from the vehicle that typically tows it, and they just leave it there taking up the parking. And again, depending on the size of them, we have the same issues that we would with the other types of oversized vehicles. So in this particular draft ordinance, what it includes would be a complete ban on oversized vehicles at all times during the day with exceptions. So one, just looking at what it is, all RVs are covered by this. RVs include camp trailers, fifth wheel trailers, motorhomes, boats, ATVs. These are things that are defined by the vehicle code. And these would be completely banned irrespective of their size. And this is, again, remember, we're just talking about parking on public streets. We're not talking about their ability that they have to still park on private property. The oversized vehicles that would also be covered under this are specific to measurements, and it would be either 22 feet in length, anything exceeding 22 feet in length, or 8 feet in height, or 8 feet in width. There is an exception that's included in the proposed, in the draft that's been provided to the council for all pickup trucks as defined by the California Vehicle Code. And so again, there's a specific measurement and size under the California Vehicle Code for what will constitute a pickup truck. And if it were to exceed that, it wouldn't qualify as a pickup truck under the Vehicle Code and therefore wouldn't qualify for the exemption here. But the idea was to allow people who are driving pickup trucks to still be able to park those vehicles. There would be limited exceptions to this. And some of them are things that we just talked about. So if somebody is actively loading or unloading a vehicle, they would be allowed to be parked there to actively load or unload. And so what might we see? Again, delivery vehicles. Someone orders up furniture, someone is moving into the city, someone orders something from UPS or FedEx, and they're delivering it to the location. Oftentimes those vehicles are oversized vehicles. And as long as they are stopping in order to load or unload from their vehicle, and take off again, they would have an exemption and they would not be prohibited. Another is performance of a service. Typically what you'll see there are contractors. Contractors who may come in and be providing some type of could be roto-rooter, it could be any of these types of services that may come, and as long as they're actively performing a service at the location by where they're parked, they would be allowed to park there and be exempted from our prohibition. Government and public utility vehicles would be exempted. School buses would be exempted, as are other types of buses. If a vehicle is broken down mechanically, they would be exempted and be allowed to park there, but with a limit of 24 hours. We also have, obviously, what's being proposed is a temporary RV parking permit. So if they have one of these temporary RV parking permits, they, of course, would be allowed to park there for the duration of that permit. Parking permits for RVs, what's being proposed, at least what's in the draft ordinance right now, would be only issued to residents. Now, residents can provide this to their guests, but it would have to be obtained by the resident. That's the way that we verify that it's not being used by other people to come and utilize our parking, and would be subject only to residents and their guests. They would be up to 12 per year, per calendar year. And that would be per address or per residential unit. So if you have a multifamily residential complex, it would be 12 per unit. If it's a single family, it would be 12 for the property. And they would be valid for 72 hours each, with a 24-hour break between the expiration of one and the validity of the second one. And that's to prevent someone from coming in and getting all 12 of them in a row and then keeping them there for 72 hours per permit consecutively. We want there to be a break in it. Parking would otherwise be prohibited in specific locations. Okay, and again, we're trying to still address the health, safety, and welfare concerns that we talked about before, about line of sight visibility, about the decreased roadway, as well as the parking. And so what we're doing is we're trying to create, irrespective of whether you have a permit or not, we're proposing some additional limitations on where these types of vehicles could be parked. And that would include within 100 feet of an intersection. Okay, so again, that's a line of sight issue. We want to make sure that at intersections, we have that line of sight. Same thing with respect to a driveway, except it would be 5 feet. So we would create at least a 5-foot barrier between where one of these oversized vehicles is parked and the curb cut of a driveway to allow for greater visibility for vehicles that are coming in and out of that driveway. We would also have other prohibitions that would prohibit any other manner that otherwise blocks a traffic lane or interferes with critical sight lines for driveways, alleys, and streets, as well as for blocking traffic control devices. So if you have a vehicle that is exempt from our prohibition, we're still going to prohibit you from parking in a manner that, for example, blocks a stop sign or blocks some other type of traffic control device. And this is all designed, again, to be able to address the health, safety, and welfare concerns that we're talking about. The ordinance, irrespective of what ordinance the city ultimately considers and ultimately adopts, none of them pursuant to the vehicle code would be effective until we get the appropriate signage posted throughout the city. And depending on the type of regulation that the city adopts, if it does adopt one, that signage would either be placed at various locations throughout the city or more likely at every main entrance to the city. So that vehicles are aware of it as they're coming into the city about the types of regulations that we have. So that concludes the presentation. Obviously, I'm available for any questions that the council may have.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we go on to council, Andrew, I'm not sure if there's any public speakers on Zoom. I know they're not in the council chambers, so if anybody wants to speak on Zoom, just have them raise their hand, and at the appropriate time, we will call on them. So I don't see any speakers anyway, so. All right, so I will start with Mayor Pro Tem Tenise Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, sir, for your thorough presentation. I do have a few questions, one of which, my first question, I think you answered already, and that was about the length, width, and height of the vehicle and whether or not it needs to meet all of those criteria, 19 to 25, 6 to 8, and 6 to 8. But I think later on in your presentation, it was or.
Correct. Any
Okay.
singular of those things would be deemed an oversized vehicle.
Okay, and good. And then the second question I have is, when Anaheim decided to not have any, were you part of that process?
I was not, no.
Okay, because I was interested to know how difficult that transition may have been. And the reason I'm asking that is because if our issue is line of sight, the issue is a line of sight, whether it's an hour or 10 days. It's still a problem when you're trying to pull out. So I'm not sure why we would have exceptions, because it's line of sight is still an issue if that large vehicle is there.
So that's part of the reason why, in at least the proposal of what's being at least shown to the council tonight purely as a draft, we have, irrespective of whether you get a permit or whether you're an exempted vehicle, there's still going to be some restrictions on where you can park even the exempted vehicles. So we would still try and protect the line of sight by creating that 100-foot distance from intersections, as well as the 5 feet from driveways, to be able to still provide at least some amount of line of sight visibility. It's not going to completely resolve the problem. And I think part of the issue with this for any jurisdiction, and I've been involved in many jurisdictions that have dealt with this, is it's always a balancing act. You're trying to balance health and safety issues with the needs of your community. And some communities rely heavily on bigger vehicles, whether it's because they have a big industrial aspect of their community, whether they are along trucking routes within their community, or whether you're a community that has lots of recreational vehicles. And I think it's always somewhat of a balancing act. And I think that's also in part how they determine the size of the vehicle. Some cities will allow slightly taller vehicles than other jurisdictions, which will stick with 6 or 7 feet, whereas other ones will go up to 8 or 9 or 10 feet. And same thing with length. As you look on the chart, and again, this was just a small sampling of them, but some of them will do length of vehicles at 25 feet instead of 22 or instead of 20. And so I think all of that is kind of a balancing act of trying to deal with the life safety issues, but also dealing with the reality of who exists in your community and the types of vehicles that they utilize.
Well, we did have an issue some time ago where we gave someone a special permit to park in an area, that one person to park a large vehicle in a certain area. But once that one person did it, everybody else went, oh, this is where we get to park. And then we had this row of oversized vehicles that was a problem.
Right.
And then we ended up having to revoke that permit, which caused all kind of havoc. So it seems to make sense not to even have those permits in the first place. And what I have seen is, for example, I have a neighbor who has family members who come to visit with an RV. And when that happens, I don't know why they do it, but they do. My neighbors pull their vehicles out of the driveway, their regular-sized vehicles out of the driveway, and they put them on the street, and then the RV parks in the driveway. That's not impacting anybody's line of sight. There's also a business that's not far from my house where sometimes they park the vehicles on the street where you can't see around them, and sometimes they pull their cars out and put those large vehicles in the driveway. It seems to make sense to me not to have the permits because there's other places to park. Because if you have the permit, then that's a line of sight issue for that 24-hour period or 5 hours or whatever period of time we designate.
I will say that, again, staff is going to be reviewing the regulations pertaining to how these vehicles can be parked on private property. But I will say is that even on private property, even in a driveway, they can create line of sight issues, not necessarily with vehicular traffic, but oftentimes based on where the driveway is, you may end up with a couple of issues. One is a garage that's not set far enough back to accommodate the length of current RVs, which are very large, and can sometimes extend over and across the sidewalk. So that creates an ADA accessibility issue. You also sometimes have a line of sight issue with it being parked along a driveway of one, and then as people are walking down the sidewalk, they can't see a vehicle that might be coming down because you might have a wide enough driveway that allows for both the parking of an RV as well as for another car to come past it. And they may not be able to see the pedestrians walking down the sidewalk. So there are potential line of sight issues even while the parking on private property. And so I know that, like I say, that staff's going to be reviewing those issues as well, but we just have to handle those separately because obviously the regulation of parking on private property will go through the Planning Commission first and then be brought to the City Council. So because they're kind of separate issues and there's a lot more considerations that go into play when regulating the parking on the private property, we're kind of handling them separately, at least at this point. But I understand what you're saying, and I will say that I think that's also part of the reason why, I don't know if the permit that you were talking about earlier, was that a permit that was issued for an extended period of time, or was that?
Yes, it was.
So that I will say is always, for me at least, from an enforcement end of things, it's always a very difficult issue because when you start granting it for an extended period of time, then you have that problem for that entire period of time. At least with the permits that we're proposing, they are for a limited duration. And most of the jurisdictions that do it, like I say, will either do it for 1 day or up to about 72 hours. There are a few jurisdictions that will give you two options. They will give you, for example, there's one jurisdiction that I work with that provides a 3-day permit or a 7-day permit. And you get X number of 3-day permits and you get X number of 7-day permits. That to me is a much more complicated process. I think it makes it harder from an enforcement standpoint. And I think it creates just, again, the greater potential for those hazards that we're talking about from a health, safety, and welfare standpoint, that I think just issuing one type of permit, if you're going to grant permits, issuing one type for a very limited period of time, in my opinion, not to exceed 3 days, is typically the better way to go. But again, it just really depends on how you want to address issues.
Well, the one that we had was a long-haul truck driver. And so sometimes he'd be there for a day, or he might be there for a week or 2 days, whenever, until
So
it's
the
time
permits
to go
that
out
are
again.
the permits that are covered under the draft ordinance that's being shown to the council, those are only applicable to recreational vehicles. They're not for other types of oversized vehicles. So that's the one thing to keep in mind, is that we're not proposing any type of permits for regular oversized vehicles. It's only for the subclass of recreational vehicles.
Got it.
So that I don't think we would end up with the same types of issues.
Excellent. I have one last comment, and then
Yes.
I'll step away. When you talked about the possibility of signage, whether on the streets or at the entrance of the city, so people can see it as they come through, somehow I think when people are entering our city, they're not really reading signage.
That is true.
So, and I think that if we're going to do this, the signage needs to be where where they're gonna park. So in neighborhoods and in intersections, rather than, you're coming into the city, you see the sign that says, "Welcome to Montclair," and maybe if you blink, that's about all you can see is those 3 words.
Typically, where they're required to be placed pursuant to the vehicle code would be at least on all the major entrances to the city, especially the ones where oversized sort of vehicles would tend to come. So we're talking the commercial routes. But yes, the city could obviously place them in additional locations as well. And you point out correctly that, not everybody's going to see it at that first location, but we also don't necessarily want to put them up on every single block across the entire city.
Okay, that concludes my comments. Thank you.
Okay, I have Councilmember Martinez next, and then after that, I have, I think, Councilmember Rue wants to speak. So, Carissa, you're next.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I have a few questions, and if some of them are better suited for the city manager, just let me know, please.
You got it?
So one of my questions is, how would we handle a situation where a homeowner already has an RV that they park outside their house currently? Do we already have rules and regulations to prevent that, or are they going to be grandfathered in?
They wouldn't be grandfathered in. I mean, grandfathering typically would only apply to private property uses, not necessarily the public property uses. So there wouldn't be a grandfathering in for them, but they would be allowed to, again, get the permits, or they could park it on their private property. And again, as to when this goes into effect would depend on 2 things. One is, as you're aware, typically laws go into effect 30 days after they're adopted or 31 days after they're adopted. The city could always propose a longer effective date further out in the future to allow people to make other accommodations for recreational vehicles that they have. And there are some cities that do that. There are some cities that still keep it going into effect in the normal time, but they have an educational campaign that they do. Even once it's in effect, they don't immediately go out and start issuing tickets. They give out notices. They try and work with people to accommodate it. And then ultimately, like I say, they won't go into effect until all the signage is up. And obviously the signage won't be done until we know what the ordinance is going to be so that we know what needs to be in that signage. So there is going to be some delay in the actual enforcement of anything, but it wouldn't be proposed that they would get any type of exemption or anything. It would just be, look, if it's oversized, we need to address the issues that we need to address, which are these health, safety, and welfare concerns. And you do have another option, which is park it on private property, put it in storage. I mean, there are other options that these vehicle owners do have. At least that's what's being proposed.
Okay. And also, you mentioned active unloading, in the case of maybe someone has a U-Haul and they're moving to a new place. What would be considered active? Are you talking someone standing there at the vehicle and it's open and people are walking in and out, or?
Typically, yes. It's going to be some. I mean, look, if the back of, let's say, a moving vehicle is open and you've got people going in who are putting things on the inside, I mean, I think your traffic control officer or whoever the enforcement officer is going to be that's going to be issuing these, and these are subject to parking citations. So we're not talking about a misdemeanor crime here. We're talking about a parking citation. Would be able to evaluate the situation like they do anything else and verify, is someone actively utilizing it? I mean, again, if everything's closed, sealed up, and there's no one in sight, the fact that they decided to unload all of their stuff and then go have a lunch break or do something else inside, that's not going to be deemed active loading and unloading. And again, remember, the idea is, for the most part, we want these vehicles not to be parked there. So even though we're allowing for the exemption for active loading and unloading, it's meant to be exactly that, active loading and unloading, and then move your vehicle so that we don't have these line of sight, decreased visibility, decreased roadway, decreased parking spaces, longer than what's absolutely necessary.
And then my last question is, I'm concerned about how something like this might affect the living situation for people that maybe rely on RVs and have lived in Montclair in RVs. And I know Walmart might be an option. I know the transit center might be an option for some people. And not only living, but livelihood for those people that have small businesses with large vehicles, like my council colleague just mentioned. Would we be able to consider alternatives that might address those concerns? And do we have a large enough concern in our city specifically that, you know, maybe we would have to designate a parking lot for those people? And then in the situation where maybe a Walmart is not feasible to keep your, you know, your work truck or your RV, what can we do in those situations? Can we consider maybe an exception for residential neighborhoods where the concern of safety is not as great? You know, maybe there's a long stretch of street where an RV parking may be appropriate rather than considering completely banning them from the entire city.
The answer is yes to all of that. Just simply put, yes. Yeah, the city could consider alternatives. So the city could, as I indicated before, designate specific areas within the city where parking of those types of vehicles would be allowed. It could find a particular stretch of roadway where we say, hey, we don't really have these issues over here, and we're okay with this whole street becoming basically a parking lot for oversized vehicles if it wanted to. As a general rule, most of the jurisdictions are much more concerned in the residential areas. So they're actually trying to stop those types of vehicles from being parked in the residential areas. Obviously, as you've seen by the charts that I put up there, I mean, most of the cities don't distinguish between residential, but the ones that do will typically prohibit much more in a much greater fashion within the residential areas, because that's where you have more driveways, more cars that are pulling in and out, you know, vehicles that are, again, we have all these other sort of, you know, pedestrians and things of that nature going on in that area. Children might be walking around or playing around in areas where it could become very dangerous because of these oversized vehicles. Whereas in maybe the industrial part of your town, you don't have that sort of an issue, or in a manufacturing part, or even in a commercial area, depending on where it is. So there are those sort of things that you can do if that's what you're trying to accommodate. It would just be a question of ultimately, again, giving direction so that we can address that within the ordinance, if that's something that the council is interested in doing.
Okay. And unlike the beach cities, I really don't imagine that Montclair is a stopping point for too many people, at least regularly. So do you know if we have a large population of residents that are living in their RVs? And maybe that's better
That I
suited
don't know.
for.
Yeah, without doing a survey, it would be difficult for us to respond to that, but I think the general answer is no. We don't have a large population of residents who are, or even temporary residents who are living in RVs on the streets or on private properties. That doesn't seem to be the issue here. It just appears to be, for the most part, people who are using on-street parking as a means for storage.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna go with Councilmember Bill Rue. You there, Bill? You there, Bill?
Second. I just lowered my hand. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yes, first of all, I would concur with the comments that were just made by Councilmember Martinez regarding some kind of a place that we can have people park. Number two, I share her concern about those who may be residents of the city and happen to live in an RV. I can say that I help, as most of you know, on the fourth Saturday of the month, give out food at CDC, and we have at least one person who does come up in an RV. They do take food, and they do park this vehicle somewhere in Montclair. This is their only shelter. And I think we need to find a way to make sure those people aren't harmed. Second of all, what do we do for a person who may be traveling on I-10? It's 3 o'clock in the morning. They just happen to be driving. They're very tired. They exit at Central Avenue. They need to stop for, 8-9 hours to get some rest. We don't have an RV park in this city. Where would they go? I think we need to figure out those type of exceptions. At 3 in the morning, they're not going to know to drive up to the police station, try to find a way to get in and get a permit. So we need to figure that one out. What do we do? And this is probably a more normal situation in Montclair, as it is in most of our neighboring suburban cities. I have my home. I happen to have a home maybe that doesn't have a large driveway. It's one of the newer ones with a shorter driveway. Grandparents are coming into town. They're going to stay for 2 weeks. RV isn't going to fit in the driveway because it's going to stick out into the street. But they could easily park it in front of the house. What do we do for those individuals? If we're looking at only 72-hour permits, it's going to be very difficult for those people. Many times grandparents spend the full time in an RV. That is not uncommon anymore. So I hope we're going to look at some of that. It's a concern to me. The other item, and it's just a larger concern, is what seems in this city increasingly to becoming the privatization of public streets. These are still public streets. They are paid for in the common, by the common. And I'm concerned every time we start ratcheting down on where people can park. They're public streets. I will go back to the issue when we had the Paseos and there was questioning about reduced parking. I remember somebody on the council said, well, what are we going to do if people want to park their RVs? They have a right to park RVs. So we need to figure that one out. Also, residents have made a substantial investment in an RV if they own one, and there may not be enough RV places nearby to store them. So I hope we think of that as we move forward looking at this. Thank you.
All right, Councilman Lopez.
Sir, what's your name again, please?
Jim?
Chip? Oh, well, obviously you don't mind me addressing by your first name.
Absolutely not,
Okay.
no.
In hearing your presentation and the comments from my colleagues, I'm kind of on the fence and on both sides on the issue. Philosophically, I am opposed to restricting public's access to the use of a public entity, be it streets or whatever, parks, what have you, because that's what they pitched in for and paid for through their taxes. You were winning me over in the first part of your presentation, and in particular regarding not having oversized vehicles obstructing the view from driveways, reduce on-street parking, less drivable space, visibility issues with them parked there. I'm with you on that. But then you started kind of losing me on some of the other comments with respect to unattached trailers, the rotor-rooter example. So here's a couple questions, and then I have some for perhaps the city manager. Regarding the unattached trailer issue, we have a lot of landscaping individuals. They have their own private business, and many times they're just operating under the table. That's just the fact of the matter. But they bring a truck, and then they have a trailer. And who's to say that they have a all-day project where they're doing tree removal, root removal, and it's going to be not just a 1-2 hour thing, but it may take the course of daylight for them to remove the items. Some of our streets do not have front driveways, access to driveway. A lot of residents have to fight for parking on a busy street. Or they have access to the back in an alley, but that not always is accessible. And I'm going to get back to the landscaping issue, but before I forget my thought, you had touched on the ADU issue. And when about a year, maybe in 2021, I had learned that since the state has mandated that localities allow for ADUs on the property, that no doubt creates a situation where available parking on that property is taken and gone.
Correct.
I had asked if we allow for the development of an ADU, and I am thinking of 2 properties on Palo Verde Street close to, guys, if you help me out, where those new 4 units, is it Vernon? Thank you. I'm visually there, but I'm forgetting the street. I have a concern that as we allow for more people to live on what was initially designated as a single-family home lot, we now are adding maybe one family and a half. They obviously, everyone needs to understand, including developers, not everybody has one, the days of one-family car are over. Everybody drives. I mean, in our family, in a big, large Mexican family of ours, all but one person in the family has a car to their name. So you got 7, 8 cars there. And they utilize the back and the front. So there's a lot of families in that situation as well. But back to, I think that's problematic, because as we are allowing ADUs, we can't put a requirement that on the property, you got to at least accommodate one car. I was told we can't do that. So where do they go? The street. And we got residents on Kingsley fighting with apartments for streets, and there's this war that went on Facebook where they were bashing each other and taking pictures of restrictions, and then they were bashing our PD for giving them a citation, parking citation. It's a problem that people didn't thoroughly think out, but yet it falls on us as the locality.
Well, this is exactly part of the problem with the oversized vehicles.
I think, in a way, in my opinion, I think it somewhat exacerbates the problem, and I'll get to my questions with the city manager. But the issue regarding the unattached trailer. So let's just say they have massive trunks. They're gonna. It's a 2-day event now. They want to leave the trailer there because they know that, oh, we can come back tomorrow, we'll finish the job, and we'll take the trailer. That they would be prohibited from doing so unless they got a permit. Correct?
So so let me back that up. Under what is in the draft, they would not be able to get a permit for that because it's not a recreational vehicle. So that's just an unattached trailer. So currently, the way that the draft is done is it would not provide for a permit for other types of oversized vehicles or for unattached trailers. The vehicle, that trailer could remain there if it were attached to the vehicle that was actually hauling that vehicle, the trailer. So it would be allowed to be parked there, assuming that it is attached to the trailer. It's when it becomes unattached that it becomes the problem. And one thing that the city could do is the city could create an exemption for unattached trailers, similar to how we're creating exemptions for other types of services that are being performed at a property. But otherwise, it would not be subject to the permitting of it, because again, the issue is still the same. And understand what I said earlier, that everything with this type of a regulation is a balancing act, right? I mean, it's a balancing act of trying to deal with the health and safety issues that result from having these oversized vehicles that are parked on streets. And unattached trailers, I mean, you're giving one example of an unattached trailer that might literally be a little tiny trailer on which they're just going to throw some landscaping. But there are lots of other types of unattached trailers that we also deal with, of all sorts of different sizes and widths and things that are loaded on top of it, which increase the obstructions to line of sight and things of that nature. So, I mean, I get where you're coming from, and I understand it. And there is an option to be able to address that by creating an exemption for that, again, for a limited period of time. The other option is they can keep it attached to a motor vehicle, at which point it would be fine and it wouldn't be subject to this, because what we're dealing with is the unattached trailers, assuming that it doesn't otherwise qualify as an oversized vehicle based on its length, width, or height.
Well, let's just say that same scenario I brought up. Those workers that were in the truck decide to take off for lunch, or they need to go run other errands while the workers are there on the property, but it's unattached. Is that ordinance going to prohibit them from being there? Because
the way that it's currently drafted, yes. But again, that's part of the reason why we're here for the study session, is to get feedback from the council, because you could create an exemption that, again, you could have an unattached trailer as long as people are actively utilizing it in the manner in which you're talking about. So where, again, we talked about the roto-rooter as being the person who's providing a service to the location. The gardeners are providing, the landscapers are providing a service to the location. So we could create an exemption that says unattached trailers, just like other types of oversized vehicles, would be exempted if they are actively providing a service at that location. So we could create that. It's just a question of getting input back from the council if that's something the council is desirous of. So it's not like you can't do it. It's just something that we would need to add into the proposed ordinance.
And in the rotor-rooter situation, obviously you have a clearly marked
Commercial vehicle.
business-defined vehicle, so you know there's a worker on the block somewhere. How are we going, and who is going to actually determine if there's actually a legitimate worker in one of the residences working before a ticket is issued? Is someone going to start going around knocking on every door to verify that there is a rotor-rooter employee fixing plumbing in a house before a citation is issued?
So, I'll do two things. One is I would defer to the police department with respect to how exactly they're going to enforce it. I can tell you that what some jurisdictions will do is if they see it there, they might leave it there for a couple of hours and kind of come back later and see if it's still there. They might wait until nighttime and see if it's still there. So there's a variety of things that can be done, but I would defer to the police department with respect to how specifically they're going to enforce that type of an issue with that type of a situation.
I think that needs to be addressed because in some instances, especially during the fall when it gets dark around 4:30, and you have a rotor-rooter come by that shows up at 1 or 2 o'clock, and their work's going to take 4 to 6 hours, you go well into the dark. I think that's problematic, and that's where I'm kind of
You might also
have
have an emergency.
reservations about.
But you might also have an emergency type situation where my pipes burst at 2 a.m. in the morning and I get somebody coming out. So I understand that that's not something that's unheard of. Again, this is a regular type of thing that happens in every jurisdiction. That's not something that's going to be addressed in an ordinance. That's an enforcement prospect. And it's just like the enforcement for any other type of law that exists and how they make determinations about things. So like I say, I would defer to the police department to respond about some of the enforcement type issues. But that logic about would I go knock on doors, would I wait 3 hours to see if it's still there, would I wait so that sort of stuff, that's not going to be something that's depicted in the ordinance. The exemption that you were talking about allowing an unattached trailer to be there for a limited period of time is something that we would have to put in the ordinance. But how we enforce it would not be in the ordinance, it would be just an enforcement protocol like anything else.
And I don't know if it's you to answer this or perhaps the city manager. Actually, it might be the city manager. You had stated at the beginning when the mayor deferred to you, sir, that we had problems a few years back, and I'm assuming that's during the COVID years, when 2020 in particular, when residents were home, unable to go places. I mean, or correct me if I'm wrong, if that was if that's not the correct time frame. I'm trying to wrap my mind around this as to what is the impetus for the need for this, because I was kind of broadsided by it when I got my packet and agenda. How many complaints did we have from 2022 to present day? Who predominantly leveled those complaints regarding parking of these vehicles? I'd like to see that data, and I would please consider this a formal request for all the complaints that came in from the COVID year of 2020 to present, and the type of individual or entity leveling those complaints is what I'd like to see. Because is this proposed ordinance the springboard, is the root, excuse me, for this ordinance the issue that my colleague Ms. Johnson brought up regarding the Palo Verde incident, or is it a culmination of things? And that's what I'm trying to wrap my mind around. I'd like some explanation or answers, please.
No, I would argue that it's not a spillover from the Palo Verde issue. That was related to the city allowing an individual who operated a dump truck to use Palo Verde Street to park on. So we removed restrictions related to parking large trucks on Palo Verde Street. The permit was authorized for this particular individual, but after that permit was issued, we saw that there were a number of other vehicles of that size and type that started parking along the entire length of Palo Verde on the north side of the street, effectively from Costco all the way west towards Monte Vista Avenue. So over the course of years, it became a major concern for the city, and most cities, including Montclair, prior to that time, never really allowed for large trucks to park on city streets. So the council made a decision that it was opportune to go back to that because it was quite apparent that the city's intent related to allowing this one individual to park on Palo Verde Street was creating a problem, and we couldn't really discriminate against others, so it either had to be allowed or we had to go back to restricting that. I think what you're seeing now is not really related to COVID. It's a spillover effect from other communities as they are adopting these sorts of restrictions on their streets. So individuals are looking for places to store their RVs. They don't want to pay to store them on RV lots. If they can park on city streets, then that is obviously the most cost-effective alternative for them. Yes, are there some people who are living in RVs? Yes, in fact, we've even been dealing with a particular individual over the last month. But that's not the germination of the issue, to restrict people from living in their RVs on city streets. It's just that we are seeing a larger accumulation of these oversized vehicles on city streets that really go back for years. Are more people buying RVs, and are they determining that for them the most convenient route is to park them on city streets as opposed to paying for them to be parked on RV lots? Or is there a decrease in the number of available RV lots that is forcing their hand? That's not an issue that we've explored. We certainly know, and I think we've reported to the council, that there are lots in the city that are available for people to rent to park their trucks and or RVs or other oversized vehicles on those lots. People choose not to do that because as long as they can park on city streets, that's what they're going to do. I'd have to have the police department do research to determine whether or not there were a number of complaints that have been filed over the course of the last several years and what those complaints are. But I think this is really more a manifestation of our own observations as to what we are seeing that is occurring on the city streets, and wanting to address a problem. So for example, if you have a home and your neighbor has an RV and they choose to park the RV in front of your house instead of their house, which is a very common practice because they don't want their view outside of their front windows to the street to be blocked by that RV that they own, so they park it in front of a neighbor's street. And those are the kind of complaints that we get from the adjoining residents who are seeing that this is an ongoing problem for them, and it's not even their RV, it's their neighbor's RV. So that's typically the kind of complaint that we would be receiving related to RVs parked on neighbor streets. But I think really, again, this is more of an issue of what our own staff has been observing. In fact, we see RV parking on Benson Avenue, Bonito Street right now, right in front of City Hall. The individual is very cognizant of the requirement to relocate the vehicle every 72 hours. So every 72 hours, he moves the vehicle a block, leaves it there for 72 hours, and then moves the vehicle right back across the street from City Hall. He's playing a game with the police department because he recognizes what the law requires of him to do in relation to his vehicle. So we can continue playing that kind of cat and mouse game with these RVs and other oversized vehicles that are parked in the streets, or we can do what other communities are more commonly doing now, and that is really recognizing that this is a public health safety issue related to all of the issues that Mr. Eckert discussed, and particularly in residential neighborhoods, the lack of available streetscape for the vehicles to be parked in residential neighborhoods because they are wide and they take up a significant amount of on-street parking in front of property and leaving very little access for vehicles going in bi-directional, particularly when they meet where that RV is. One would have to pull over to the side typically and let that vehicle pass because there simply isn't space for two vehicles and an RV parked on the street to get by in those areas. So we think that it's more of a public safety issue, and it's not really the city's business to be in the to be providing parking or storage space for oversized vehicles. They need to be stored in appropriate areas, and they create vandalism problems for the community as well because they become the target of vandalism by individuals, and then that becomes a problem for the city to deal with as well. So we think we're addressing a number of issues by bringing this proposed draft ordinance forward. And as Mr. Eckert indicated, this is just a draft. We're soliciting any information or recommendations from the City Council. We realize that nuanced changes will have to be made to the ordinance to accommodate the specific needs for our community. And we will certainly work with those nuances to make this ordinance work for the City Council and the City of Montclair.
Thank you, Mr. City Manager. Agree with you that you say the city is not in the
Councilman
business.
Lopez, I apologize, but we're at 6:41, and I haven't had a chance to speak yet, and we got a meeting at 7 PM. So I apologize.
Well, just for clarification, Mr. City Manager, we are going to bring this back for discussion again in the future?
Well, we'd probably bring it back as a recommended ordinance for consideration. We don't usually come back for additional workshops unless we feel that we need to do that. I will note that in relation to the concerns that you've expressed, and as well as others, we can introduce an appeal process. So if there's an individual who gets a citation, just like other parking permits, they can appeal to the police department, particularly, for example, for a commercial vehicle. And we can also create an exemption for commercial vehicles, as long as it's during the daytime when a commercial vehicle would be working on a request or work order for a particular property. If that vehicle's on the street from 7 a.m. until 6 p.m., we could provide an exemption for those kinds of commercial utility vehicles. After that, I think that they would have to be off of the street unless they're at a midnight call to address a roto-rooter issue, for example. But in any event, that kind of an exemption and an appeal process, I think, would address all the concerns that we've heard expressed tonight.
And I would,
There already is an appeal process because this would be subject to a parking ticket, and so there's already an appeal process for parking tickets.
I just want to go on record. I do want something to provide an exemption for the scenario that I brought up and raised with respect to a detached trailer for purposes of work on property, ongoing work on property that may take 1 or 2 days, like, this is just one example, extensive tree removal. And I do have a question regarding the determination on the fee.
Councilmember Lopez, if I can ask you one question. One of the exemptions that's already in there is if the work that they're doing is subject to a permit. So if they get a public works permit, that would allow them to actually be there. And most of the times, technically, if you're doing some of that stuff, depending on what it is, they may need to get a permit anyways. So just keep that in mind. I mean, again, we can make a more clear exemption specific to that type of scenario, but there are other exemptions that I didn't go over that might also address that sort of a situation.
And I do have some questions regarding the amount of the fee. That was going to be my next question and discussion. But I will yield back to the city mayor.
Okay, so it's 6:43. I'm going to agree with what City Manager Starr said. We do have an issue with RVs. I'm going to use the city of Pomona as an example. They adopted their ordinance, I think, last fall, or last spring, excuse me, a year to this time. And that's probably caused some proliferation of RVs in our city. Gabe, you have a second? Come on up, Gabe. I want to, Gabe, just give me your experiences in RVs, since you and I have talked about this issue, and I know you're out there, been on the streets and trying to assist these people in RVs, and I know you can barely walk, but give me a 2-minute answer, or 3 minutes at best, and I'm going to say.
Mayor, what was your question?
My question is, what's your experience with the RVs parked on the streets in Montclair? I know your team's been out there, been trying to assist them, work with them. What's your experience? What do you see out there?
Well, we're receiving multiple complaints, and it's not just related to people living in their RVs, but we are seeing numerous oversized vehicles on our streets now. And I think one of the things that we probably need to take into consideration is, I know everybody is worried about residents that own these RVs and they're parking them on the street and they may not have anywhere to put them, but for every one of those people that have them, we're probably receiving 2 or 3 complaints on that vehicle from other residents who are having to endure problems, either line of sight issues or blocking vision when they're backing out of driveways. That's been a recent complaint. And also people living in them and moving every 72 hours. I mean, it covers a broad range of problems when we're talking about these oversized vehicles now, including box trucks, that people that own businesses, and now they're just, they don't have a storage place for them, so what do? They park them on the street. And they're not really running a business out of their house, but they do have that vehicle that they use for businesses, and instead of having it at their shop or wherever, they're ending up right in front of the residents or their neighbor's residence. So the range of problems with these oversized vehicles are not just related to people that are living in them. It covers a broad range of problems, and it's our residents that are actually calling and complaining about these things that are happening. So I know that we want to work with our residents, we don't want to punish them, we want to come up with something fair, but it's affecting our good residents as well. And that's where our complaints are coming from.
Mr. Mayor, if I may add just a quick question, comment,
Go ahead.
and that is, oftentimes in the planning department, we hear about issues about trucks parking on the street and blocking, and they're sort of unusual for a residential setting, but they don't want to make complaints. They just verbalize it to us, well, Sylvia and I, and then they walk away. But if we ask them to make a complaint, they'll usually
Yeah.
defer on those things. So that happens a lot too.
Okay, so let's do this. I think staff's heard everybody's comments. I think we need an ordinance in place, a restriction. I know the city of Pomona has an ordinance where they at least restrict between the hours 8 p.m. and 7 a.m. with a 4-hour parking restriction between 7 a.m. and 8 p.m. I guess that's one of my questions in my mind, but I'd like to see that maybe staff can take another stab at the ordinance and bring it back. Let's just bring it back to another workshop, a second workshop on this. I'll let you Ed decide when to bring that back. Does anybody have an opinion on the 8 p.m., 7 a.m.? Or you want a 24-hour restriction, or you want to think about it for the next workshop? Let staff know about it, or staff can place that
I
in
would
there?
like time to think about it and look at the issue. I want to talk to a few people. Thanks.
Okay. Anybody else?
I'm
Real
not
quick?
I'm not comfortable going with any recommendation at this point. I'm open to all the possibilities, but I don't want to state that I'm for one time frame or the other at this moment.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yes, Mr. Mayor, I think a line of sight issue is a line of sight issue. Doesn't matter what time of day it is, it's still a line of sight issue.
All right. Anybody else? Okay.
Well, but please don't misconstrue my position. I'm with you on the line of sight issue. If there is a RV that is parked on a driveway, but the butt of it sticks out onto the sidewalk, I'm against that. I totally am against that. If it blocks a person's access from making a turn on a street because they can't see it because of an RV, totally with you on that. It's other reasons that I have some reservations.
Okay, so Ed, let's just do this. Bring back a draft ordinance. You heard our comments raised by each of the council members in regards to parking, daytime operators, and maybe this, I don't know, do we consider is it 24 hours or from 8 p.m. to 7 a.m. as a restriction? So I think that's all we got to do right now. I know I have to open up, allow for public comment. Do we have members of the public wish to speak on this particular meeting? I don't think we have anybody, Andrea, so with that, we're adjourned. Thank you.